A black girl like you should be thanking this court for letting you breathe in here.
Then maybe this court has forgotten what justice is supposed to sound like.
Careful, Miss Carter, one more word and I'll bury your career before it even begins.
A black girl like you should be thanking this court for letting you breathe in here. Judge Harold Beckett's words didn't just echo through courtroom 4B. They split the room open. A few people laughed too quickly. Others looked down, pretending not to hear what everyone had just heard. I stood there with my file locked against my chest, every muscle in my body pulled tight, feeling the heat rise behind my eyes but refusing to let it spill. If I cried, I would become exactly what men like him expected. Fragile, overwhelmed, easy to dismiss. My name is Naomi Carter, and at 27, I was a junior litigation associate at one of Atlanta's most respected firms. I was also one of the only black women in that division, which meant I had long ago learned how to survive rooms where people smiled at my resume and doubted my right to stand behind it. Judge Harold Beckett sat above me in black robes, silver-haired, clean-cut, and admired by half the legal community in Georgia. He had the face of a statesman and the instincts of a man who had spent decades deciding who counted and who did not. His expression was calm now, almost amused, like humiliating me in public had cost him nothing. Across the aisle sat Martin Hale, lead counsel for the city, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a polished navy suit, expensive cufflinks, and the smug stillness of someone certain the outcome had been arranged long before the hearing began. He didn't smile when the judge insulted me. He didn't need to. Men like Hale saved their cruelty for silence. I should not have been standing there alone. My supervising attorney, Richard Lawson, a sharp but overworked partner in his 50s, had collapsed outside the courtroom less than 10 minutes earlier, clutching his chest before paramedics rushed him away. The case had landed in my hands with no warning, no preparation window, and no sympathy from anyone who mattered. Judge Beckett leaned back. "Well," he said, "has the lesson settled in, Miss Carter?" I heard my mother's voice before I heard my own. Laverne Carter, night shift nurse, daughter of a mechanic, and the strongest person I had ever known, used to come home at dawn smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion. She paid my school fees in overtime hours and raised me on one principle: never let powerful people define you before you speak for yourself. So I lifted my head. "I'm still standing, Your Honor," I said. The room changed. Not much, just enough. At the side wall near the security entrance stood Ellis Boone, an older black court officer with graying temples and a face lined by years of watching injustice pass itself off as procedure. He gave me one small nod. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet signal that somebody in that room understood exactly what had just happened. Then I noticed someone else. In the second row of the press section, a young reporter had stopped typing and was staring directly at the bench. Emily Ross couldn't have been older than 25. She had auburn hair twisted into a loose knot, a slim blazer, and the alert, sharpened gaze of someone who had just realized the story in front of her was no longer routine. She wasn't watching me. She was watching Beckett. Good, I thought. Let somebody else see him. Martin Hale rose first and launched into the city's argument, smooth and rehearsed, dismissing our claim as procedural theater. I barely heard the first minute. I was reorganizing my notes, forcing my hands to steady, reminding myself that this hearing was about Marcus Hill, a black father who had lost years to a system that preferred convenience over truth. When Hale finally sat down, Beckett looked at me again, patient now, almost eager. "Go on then, Miss Carter," he said. "Show us what they trained you to do." Every face turned toward me. This time, no one laughed. I placed my file on the table, stepped forward, and opened my mouth. I stepped to the podium with my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The courtroom had gone still after Judge Beckett's last remark, and I knew every person in that room was waiting for me to fail quickly, neatly, and in a way that would confirm everything they already believed about me. I set my file down, opened it, and reached instinctively into my blazer pocket. My fingers closed around my father's old fountain pen. The black lacquer was scratched, the silver clip slightly bent, but I had carried it through law school, bar prep, and every hearing that mattered. My father used to say, "When your voice shakes, let your hand remember who you are." I rolled the pen once between my fingers, steadied my breath, and began. I argued first from procedure, because that was the only language men like Beckett pretended to respect. The city wanted the court to treat Marcus Hill's petition like a nuisance, an old matter already buried, already decided. But as I turned to the archived appendix that Richard Lawson had flagged before collapsing, I found something that had not been highlighted in his notes. Wedged between photocopied police summaries and brittle court filings was a witness statement dated 3 days before Marcus Hill's original trial. It was unsigned in the court index, never referenced in the city's briefing, and marked with an internal notation I had never seen disclosed. I stopped speaking for half a second. Then I read the first line silently again. The witness had identified another man fleeing the scene. The moment I lifted the document, the air in the room changed. "Your Honor," I said more carefully now, "before this court dismisses the petition as settled, the record should account for a suppressed witness statement that directly points to an alternate suspect." Martin Hale shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped across the floor. He demanded that I stop, called the paper unauthenticated, irrelevant, improper, anything he could reach first. His smooth confidence cracked into anger. That told me more than his words did. I asked permission to mark the statement for identification and move it into the record. Hale objected again, louder this time. Around us, the benches stirred. People whispered. A hearing everyone thought was routine suddenly sounded dangerous. That was when I looked toward the plaintiff's table and really saw Marcus Hill. He was a black man in his mid-40s, lean from hardship, with tired eyes that looked older than the rest of his face. His suit didn't fit well, like it had been borrowed for the day, and his hands were locked so tightly together his knuckles had gone pale. In the file, I had only seen dates and prison numbers. Sitting there, he became real. Marcus had been convicted when he was still young enough to think time could be recovered. He had lost nearly half his life inside a cell because a system had preferred closure over truth. When our eyes met, I saw something raw in his expression. Not hope yet, because hope is expensive when the law has already failed you, but the fear of seeing the truth appear and disappear all over again. From the press row, Emily Ross was no longer pretending to be casually interested. She had set aside one notebook and opened another, the kind reporters use when they realize the official story has cracked. Her pen moved fast as Hale argued, and Beckett interrupted me twice in a span of 30 seconds. I saw her glance not at me, but at the judge. She was tracking his reactions, and for one brief, unguarded instant, she had reason to. When I handed the statement to the clerk and repeated the date aloud, Judge Beckett's face changed. It was tiny, just a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, a stiffness in the jaw, but it did not belong to a man hearing useless information. It looked like fear arriving before discipline could hide it. He recovered almost immediately. The gavel came down. His voice returned colder, flatter, more controlled. He would not admit the statement into evidence yet, he said. The court would recess briefly to review the document's provenance and determine whether further argument was appropriate. Hale sat down hard, still furious. Marcus did not move. Emily kept writing, and I stood there with my father's pen still in my hand, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. That paper had been buried on purpose. The hearing was no longer about whether the past could stay closed. It was about who had worked so hard to keep it that way. The hearing ended without resolution, but not without damage. By the time I stepped out of courtroom 4B, the courthouse no longer felt like a building. It felt like a body that had just swallowed a secret and was trying very hard not to choke on it. People moved around me in lowered voices. Some avoided my eyes, others stared too long. Martin Hale disappeared through a side corridor with his jaw clenched, and Judge Beckett never looked in my direction again before leaving the bench. Waiting near the elevators was Ethan Brooks, the firm's senior trial consultant, a white attorney in his late 50s with tired blue eyes, a loosened tie, and the kind of worn composure that only comes from years of losing faith slowly instead of all at once. He had once been one of the most respected litigators in Atlanta before stepping back from the spotlight. "You rattled that room," he said quietly, falling into step beside me. "Now let's find out why." He took me downstairs to records, where the courthouse air turned colder and the walls smelled like dust, cardboard, and neglect. We spent the next hour going box by box through archived material tied to Marcus Hill's original conviction. Ethan moved with the patience of someone who had done this too many times before. As we searched, he spoke more openly than I expected. Years ago, he said, he had almost left the law entirely after watching case after case involving black defendants get brushed aside, delayed, or quietly buried while judges called it fairness and prosecutors called it order. You tell yourself the next case will be different, he muttered, pulling a file from a cracked banker's box. Then one day you realize the system isn't failing by accident. I looked at him differently after that. He wasn't helping me out of kindness. He was trying to make peace with something old inside himself. The break came in a personnel file binder no one had bothered to re-index. I found the name first. Harold Beckett. Not under the judicial section, under prosecution assignments. My eyes ran over the line twice before my brain accepted it. Lead Assistant District Attorney, State versus Marcus Hill. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misread it. Then Ethan leaned over my shoulder and went completely still. We pulled every related page we could find. Staff rosters, filing logs, case assignment sheets, and each one said the same thing in a different format. Harold Beckett had not merely been around that case. He had led it. The judge now presiding over Marcus Hill's petition was one of the very men who had helped put him away for 19 years. That alone would have been enough to turn my stomach. But the next piece made it worse. Buried in an old press packet was a photograph from the week of Marcus's arrest. The image was grainy, but the faces were clear enough. 2 homicide detectives, a police spokesman, and a much younger Harold Beckett standing at the podium in a dark suit, one hand on the table, looking proud of what they had done. I held the photo beneath the desk lamp and felt something inside me harden. This was no distant procedural link. He had stood publicly beside the machinery that sold Marcus Hill as a solved problem. Ethan looked at the photo, then at me. "That's your first real fracture," he said. "Conflict, history, motive to keep the past sealed." Marcus was waiting for us in a consultation room upstairs when we returned. Without the courtroom between us, he looked smaller somehow, more tired, like adrenaline had been the only thing keeping him upright. When I told him what we had found, he didn't speak for several seconds. Then he sat back and stared at the wall. "My daughter was 6 when they took me," he said finally. His voice was flat in the way pain becomes when it has been carried too long. "She used to draw pictures of me coming home. My sister kept them. By the time I got out, she was grown, college age. She didn't need a father anymore. She needed an explanation." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only respectful response to stolen years. I left that room with the photograph in one hand and the assignment sheet in the other, understanding the shape of the truth for the first time. Harold Beckett was not just biased against me. He was not simply protecting the city. He was protecting himself. And if that was true, then every insult, every objection, every effort to shut me down in that courtroom had never been about my inexperience at all. It had been about fear. The next morning, I walked into the office carrying copies of the assignment sheet, the old press photo, and a legal pad full of notes I had barely slept enough to organize. I knew exactly what the evidence meant, and I knew what it required me to do next. Put Harold Beckett's connection to Marcus Hill's original prosecution on the record. I had expected resistance from the city. I had not expected resistance from my own firm. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting in a glass conference room on the 32nd floor while 2 senior partners stared at me like I had brought a live grenade into the building. One of them, Gerald Whitman, a silver-haired corporate rainmaker with a voice smooth enough to make surrender sound reasonable, told me to stay focused on relief, not headlines. The other, Susan Keller, a sharp-featured partner known for her political connections, leaned forward and said, "Do not turn this into a race issue or a political spectacle, Naomi. Keep it narrow. Help Marcus. Leave the judge alone." What they were really saying was simpler. Do not touch power unless power invites you. I argued back harder than I should have, or maybe exactly as hard as I had to. Marcus Hill had not lost 19 years because of bad luck. He had lost them because men inside the system made choices. Gerald's jaw tightened when I said that. Susan replied that judges were protected figures, and that accusing Beckett of undisclosed prior involvement could damage the firm irreparably. "You are too junior to understand how this works," she told me. I understood perfectly. They did not fear being wrong. They feared being right in public. By the time the meeting ended, I had been instructed to clear all media contact through management and submit every filing draft for review. They were trying to wrap my case in procedure until it suffocated. When I stepped out of the conference room, I found Tessa Monroe waiting by my desk with a sympathetic expression. Tessa was a mid-level associate, polished, warm, and someone I had trusted with more than one late-night panic in that office. She squeezed my arm and whispered, "They're overreacting. Just give them time." At the moment, I believed she meant it. By early afternoon, the pressure turned stranger. When I opened my work email to send Ethan revised notes, half my correspondence was gone. Draft motions, archived messages, even the scanned copy request I had sent records the day before. IT blamed a sync error. I did not believe them. Then I noticed the same dark sedan behind me when I left for the courthouse annex, and again when I drove back toward Midtown. Maybe it was coincidence once. It was not coincidence twice. I began checking mirrors without meaning to. At red lights, my shoulders locked. Back at the office, Tessa avoided my eyes. That was when the pattern snapped into place. Hours later, I walked past Gerald's office and heard my own name through the half-closed door. Tessa's voice was low, hurried. She was updating him, what I had copied, who I had met, what Ethan was helping me review. I kept walking before they saw me, but something inside me went cold. Betrayal is clarifying that way. That evening, my mother called before I made it home. I heard the strain in her breathing before she said a word. Laverne Carter had spent most of her life sounding stronger than whatever room she was in, so fear in her voice landed like a blow. A man had called the house from a blocked number. He told her I needed to learn my place and stop embarrassing people who could ruin me. He never identified himself. He didn't have to. I pulled over on Peachtree just to steady my hands on the wheel. I told her I was fine, lied that these things happened in high-profile cases, and begged her not to answer unknown numbers for a while. She was quiet, then said, "Baby, men only threaten women like us when they think we might actually matter." I sat there in silence after we hung up, staring through the windshield at city lights that suddenly looked harder, sharper, less like opportunity and more like warning. By the time I reached my apartment, Emily Ross had already done what my firm feared most. Buried on the Metro page of the evening legal brief was a short item under her byline: questions raised over possible conflict in Atlanta courtroom. She did not name everything, but she named enough: an old conviction, a resurfaced witness statement, a presiding judge facing quiet scrutiny over prior ties to a reopened matter. It was small, careful, and devastatingly smart. Somebody out there would read it and start asking their own questions. I barely had time to absorb that before I unlocked my front door and felt the air shift. Drawers had been yanked open, papers were scattered across the floor, couch cushions were split. My desk had been turned inside out. They had not taken jewelry, cash, or my laptop. They had gone straight for the case materials. Whoever had been inside my apartment had not come to rob me. They had come to search me. And standing there in the wreckage, with Emily's article still glowing on my phone screen, I understood that this was no longer pressure. The machine had noticed me, and now it had started to move. I did not sleep much after finding my apartment torn apart. By morning, fear had settled into something colder and more useful. Whoever had gone through my home had confirmed what I already suspected. Someone connected to this case was watching every move I made. If I wanted to prove Harold Beckett had buried that witness statement on purpose, I needed someone who had seen it happen. Ethan helped me retrace old investigative logs, personnel notes, and retirement directories until one name surfaced again and again in the margins of the original file: Derek Vaughn. He had been one of the detectives assigned to the case before trial, a field investigator who handled witness interviews and evidence routing. By noon, I was driving south of Atlanta toward a quiet subdivision where the lawns were neat, the porches were screened in, and every house seemed built for people trying to disappear into ordinary life. Derek Vaughn opened the door wearing a faded gray polo and the guarded expression of a man who had spent years learning not to answer questions too quickly. He was in his 60s now, broad through the shoulders, with a tired face that suggested old authority worn down by private regret. The moment I introduced myself and said Marcus Hill's name, he tried to close the door. I stopped it with my hand. "I'm not here to trap you," I said. "I'm here because a man lost 19 years, and I think you know why." That made him hesitate, but not enough to let me in. He said he was retired, done with all of it, and too old to dig up trouble that could cost him his pension. Then his son appeared in the hallway behind him. Caleb Vaughn, early 30s, heavy-set, tense and openly hostile, stepped forward and told me to leave. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said. "My dad says one word, this family gets dragged into hell." Derek didn't argue with him. That scared me more than the anger did. I might have left then if Caleb's warning hadn't sounded so familiar. Instead, I told Derek something I had not planned to say. I told him about my father, how years before he died, he had been pulled over by officers who claimed his car matched a robbery description. They held him on the curb for hours, planted suspicion where there was none, and let him go without apology when they realized they had nothing. He was never charged, never jailed, never officially ruined. But something in him changed after that. He spent the rest of his life talking about how easy it had been for strangers with badges to turn him into a threat because he was a black man in the wrong neighborhood with the wrong skin. He carried that bitterness like a second spine, I told Derek. So when I look at Marcus Hill, I don't see an old file. I see what happens when that humiliation becomes permanent. Derek's face shifted. Not agreement yet, but recognition. He finally let me inside. The house smelled like coffee and old paper. Caleb stayed in the next room, pacing loudly enough to make his disapproval clear. Derek sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window before speaking. He admitted he had handled the alternate suspect witness interview personally. He remembered it because the woman had been scared but certain. She gave details that did not match Marcus Hill at all. Derek said he routed the statement as required, and 2 days later, it vanished from the working file. He asked questions once. Harold Beckett, then lead prosecutor, told him the statement was unreliable and ordered the case to move forward. "He didn't ask," Derek said quietly. "He took it." I pulled out my notepad, but he stopped me. "No notes unless I agree to all of it," he said. He still feared what could happen if his words left that room. In the driveway outside, Ethan texted me a single line. "Safe location ready if he talks." He had quietly arranged a temporary place for Derek to stay, just in case. When I explained that Ethan could move him somewhere discreet and protect his statement until the hearing, Caleb came back into the kitchen furious. He said no affidavit was worth losing a retirement, a home, or the peace they had left. For a few minutes, the room belonged to their fear instead of my argument. Then Derek looked at his son and said, "Peace built on a lie isn't peace." The silence after that was longer than any speech I could have made. At last, Derek took the pen I offered him and signed a sworn affidavit stating that Harold Beckett had personally removed the witness statement pointing away from Marcus Hill. His hand shook once on the signature line, then steadied. When I brought the affidavit to Marcus later that evening, he read the first page, covered his mouth, and started crying before he could finish. It was the first time I had seen him break. Not because he was weak, because after 19 years, somebody had finally chosen truth over fear. Derek Vaughn's affidavit should have felt like a breakthrough. Instead, it felt like the first crack in something far larger than a single man's corruption. I sat in Ethan's office after midnight with the signed statement in front of me, reading the same lines over and over until the words stopped looking like evidence and started looking like a warning. Harold Beckett had personally removed a witness statement that could have kept Marcus Hill from losing 19 years of his life. But the more I looked at the file, the less it made sense as the act of one frightened prosecutor protecting one bad decision. Men like Beckett buried evidence to save careers. This felt bigger, more expensive, more organized. Derek's account, combined with several loose financial disclosures Ethan had quietly pulled from old civic records, suggested the same ugly truth. Beckett had not acted alone. The names started forming a pattern before I wanted to admit it. Assistant prosecutors who later landed city appointments. Police commanders who moved into consulting roles. A deputy mayor who had publicly praised swift justice in Marcus's case weeks before trial. And threaded through it all was one name that kept reappearing in campaign reports, board memberships, and prison contracting disclosures. Charles Whitfield. Whitfield was one of those men Atlanta liked to call a philanthropist in public and a kingmaker in private. He funded scholarship galas, stood beside elected officials in tailored suits, and sat on enough civic committees to make himself look indispensable. But he had made his fortune through a holding group tied to private detention logistics, prison services, and state correctional supply contracts. Ethan said his name with visible disgust. "Men like Whitfield never need to touch the dirty work," he muttered. "They just build incentives so other people do it for them." I looked again at Marcus's file and felt the pieces sliding toward each other in the dark. The next push came from Emily Ross. She called me from outside City Hall, voice tight with adrenaline, and said she had found something I needed to see. We met in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, where she slid photocopies across the table instead of speaking right away. Emily had traced campaign contribution records from the year Marcus was prosecuted and found a series of donations routed through Whitfield-backed PACs into the mayor's re-election machine. Not huge enough to cause a scandal by themselves. Smart money, not loud money. But the dates mattered. Several transfers lined up with city contract approvals and public statements about crime policy, prison expansion, and sentencing efficiency. On one page, Whitfield's name appeared beside a fundraising dinner attended by the mayor, 2 police administrators, and Harold Beckett, then still a rising prosecutor. Emily looked at me and said, "This doesn't feel like a courtroom story anymore." She was right. It felt like a business model wearing the mask of law. Back at the office, Ethan finally told me something about himself I think he had been carrying for years. There had been another case long before I joined the firm. Another black defendant, another shaky file, another set of quiet inconsistencies that nobody in power wanted examined too closely. Ethan had seen enough to know something was wrong, but not enough, he told himself, to risk everything. So he chose caution. The man took a plea, disappeared into the system, and Ethan never forgot it. "That's the trick," he said, staring at Marcus's affidavit instead of at me. "The machine doesn't need every lawyer to be evil. It just needs enough of us to decide that survival is more practical than courage." I understood then why he had stood beside me so firmly from the moment this began. He was not just helping me fight Marcus's case. He was trying to answer for a silence that had outlived the man it failed. I went home with Emily's records, Ethan's confession, and Derek's affidavit spread across my passenger seat like separate pieces of the same wound. Somewhere between the courthouse, City Hall, and the prison contracts, the truth sharpened into something almost unbearable. Marcus Hill had not been convicted simply because the system was flawed. He had been convicted because his conviction served people who profited from fear, control, and bodies in cells. A poor black man accused of violence was not, to them, a human life requiring fairness. He was throughput, a talking point, a contract line, a number that made money move. I sat in my parked car for a long time before going inside, staring at the lights of Atlanta and realizing with complete certainty that this was no longer just a wrongful conviction case. It was a revenue structure built on injustice. And once I saw that, I could not unsee it. By the time I walked back into courtroom 4B, the room no longer belonged to Harold Beckett. It belonged to tension. Every bench was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. Lawyers who had no business in that courtroom found reasons to be there anyway. I carried everything with me. Derek Vaughn's sworn affidavit, the old staffing records naming Beckett as lead prosecutor, the press photograph from Marcus Hill's arrest, campaign donation records tied to Charles Whitfield, and internal notes Ethan had organized through the night. My arms were full, but my mind was clear. This was the hearing they had tried to prevent from ever happening. Across the room, Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark suit that still did not quite fit him, his hands resting over a worn photograph of his daughter. He looked as if he were holding the last piece of his stolen life together with his fingers. Beckett entered with his usual polished control, but I saw the difference immediately. He did not look at the gallery first. He looked at me. Martin Hale rose when the session opened and launched into an argument designed to box me in before I could speak. He called my filings reckless, inflammatory, speculative. He asked the court to strike the affidavit, suppress the financial exhibits, and sanction me for trying to turn a post-conviction hearing into political theater. I let him finish. Then I stood and began laying the documents out one by one. First, the old personnel assignment sheet, then the witness affidavit, then the press photo, then the campaign records, then the internal routing notes. I did not rush. I named each exhibit clearly, calmly, and in order. With every page placed on the table, the room grew quieter. Not because people lost interest, because they understood they were watching a structure come apart. I turned toward the bench and forced Beckett to face what he had spent decades hiding. I read his full name from the staffing file, his title from the prosecution roster, and the date from the witness statement Derek said Beckett had personally removed. I held up the photograph showing him beside police at the press conference after Marcus's arrest. Then I tied the financial exhibits to the broader pressure surrounding the case: money, politics, prison interests, and the speed with which Marcus Hill had been turned into a conviction. Beckett's face hardened by degrees until his anger overtook his performance. He cut me off twice. I kept going. He ordered me to sit down. I refused. He called my conduct disgraceful and said one more step would put me in contempt. The threat rolled through the courtroom, but this time no one laughed. He was no longer the man humiliating me from a position of effortless power. He was a man being dragged backward toward his own history. The silence broke only when Beckett slammed his gavel and half rose from the bench, ready to bury the hearing by force if he could not control it by intimidation. And then the rear doors opened. Every head in the room turned. Ellis Boone, the older black court officer who had once given me that silent nod when I thought I might break, straightened to his full height and stepped aside with deliberate calm. He did not look at Beckett. He opened the path. Two officials from the State Judicial Oversight Commission entered first, followed by federal investigators in dark jackets with credentials already in hand. For the first time since I had known his name, Harold Beckett looked genuinely unprepared. One of the oversight officials addressed him clearly, formally, and loud enough for the press benches to hear. He was being ordered to step away from the bench, pending immediate review of undisclosed prior involvement and related misconduct concerns. The courtroom didn't erupt right away. It froze. That was the strangest part. It was as if the whole building needed one full breath to accept what it had just witnessed. Then sound returned all at once. Chairs scraping, whispers breaking, reporters reaching for phones, pens, cameras, everything. Emily Ross was already moving, broadcasting live from the side aisle with the steady, focused urgency of someone who knew history did not wait for better lighting. I caught a flash of her phone screen angled toward the bench as Beckett was told again, this time more sharply, to leave his seat. Martin Hale looked stunned into silence. Ethan did not smile. He only exhaled, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for years and had finally heard it crack. I turned toward Marcus as the officials moved Beckett away from the bench. Marcus had not stood. He was staring straight ahead, gripping the photograph of his daughter so tightly that the edges bent in his hands. When the reviewing judge assigned to make the immediate procedural ruling spoke the words that Marcus Hill's conviction was to be vacated, pending formal entry and restoration proceedings, Marcus lowered his head and closed his eyes. He did not shout. He did not collapse. One tear slipped down his face, then another. For 19 years, the system had called him guilty. Now, in a room that had once laughed at me and erased him, his name was finally spoken with the thing it should have carried all along: innocence. By sunset, Marcus Hill's conviction was no longer just under review. It was gone. The order came down in language so clean it almost felt unreal. Vacated, reversed, wrongful. For 19 years, the state had called him a criminal. In less than a page, that lie was stripped of its robe and title. Outside the courthouse, cameras crowded the steps, and microphones rose like a second fence. But none of that mattered as much as the look on Marcus's face. He stood there, blinking against the light like a man learning how to exist in his own life again. Then, as federal agents escorted Harold Beckett out through a side entrance, word spread through the crowd before anyone officially confirmed it. The judge who had mocked me from the bench had been placed in handcuffs the moment he cleared the courtroom doors. That arrest was only the first crack. Once Beckett fell, the others started falling fast. Because corruption looks powerful right up until the moment people realize it bleeds. Within days, a retired police chief was taken into custody for evidence tampering and conspiracy. 2 former prosecutors were indicted on misconduct charges tied to Marcus's case, and several others buried under the same machine. Gerald Whitman, my own firm's polished senior partner, the man who had told me not to touch power unless power invited me, was arrested for obstruction after investigators traced internal efforts to suppress records and intimidate witnesses. I watched every headline with a strange calm, because none of it felt like revenge. It felt like overdue accounting. The loudest collapse came last. Emily Ross's investigation exploded beyond Atlanta after she published a full exposé linking Charles Whitfield's prison money, campaign donations, and backroom influence to the convictions that had made men like Marcus profitable. Her reporting moved from metro pages to national broadcasts in less than a week. Suddenly, Whitfield's charity dinners, smiling photos, and civic awards looked less like leadership and more like camouflage. Protesters gathered outside his office tower before dawn on the morning federal agents arrived. By lunchtime, Charles Whitfield, the man who had hidden behind contracts, shell groups, and polite applause, was led out in a tailored suit with his wrists cuffed in front of him. A billionaire architect of suffering, reduced to a booking photo. That was the moment the city understood this had never been one bad judge. It had been an industry. Marcus's victory became real to me not in court, not in headlines, but on the courthouse lawn 3 days later. His daughter came through the crowd slowly, like someone crossing into a memory she had not trusted herself to need anymore. She was 25 now, composed in the way children of loss often are, holding herself together until the last possible second. Marcus looked at her as if he were afraid to move too fast and lose her again. Then she reached him, threw both arms around him, and said the word he had been denied for nearly half her life. Dad. Just that. One syllable. Marcus broke completely. So did half the people watching. For all the legal language, all the filings, all the strategy, this was what justice sounded like when it finally got personal. I resigned from my old firm the same week. No dramatic speech, no farewell lunch, just a letter, a cleared desk, and one last look at the office that had mistaken caution for wisdom. 3 months later, in the neighborhood where I had grown up, I unlocked the front door of the Carter Justice Center. The building used to be a shuttered insurance office with cracked blinds and bad wiring. We rebuilt it room by room. On opening day, my mother stood in the front row wearing the same old Navy nursing scrubs she had worn through half my childhood, the uniform that had paid for my books, my bus fare, my future. She cried before I did. Ethan stood beside her with a smile he had earned the hard way. Emily came with a camera crew, but for once she left the microphone lowered. She knew some moments were bigger than coverage. That evening, after the crowd was gone and the lights had settled into silence, I sat alone in my new office and placed my father's old fountain pen in the center of my desk. The black lacquer was still scratched. The silver clip was still bent. But it looked different there. Less like a keepsake, more like a promise. Outside my window, families from my neighborhood walked past a building that now belonged to them too. Inside, case folders were already stacked for people who had spent years being ignored, misread, or buried by systems built to profit from their pain. The woman they laughed at in Harold Beckett's courtroom was gone. In her place was someone they had made by trying to break her. And from that day on, every time another family walked through my door, I remembered the same thing. Silence is how they keep their power. So I left the pen where I could always see it, and I never stayed silent again. And if there is one thing this fight taught me, it is this. Evil survives when good people stay silent. Racism does not always come wearing a hood or shouting in the street. Sometimes it hides behind a courtroom bench, a polished smile, a title, or a system that keeps telling Black people to wait their turn. But I believe God sees what men try to bury. I believe He hears every cry that power refuses to hear. And I believe that sooner or later, the truth always stands up. So now I want to ask you, if you had been in that courtroom, would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood with me? Have you ever seen someone judged, rejected, or mistreated just because of the color of their skin? Share your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters more than you know. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories. Your support helps this channel keep bringing these stories to life.